Hello again, I'm Tripp Rogers, and this is Tripp's Take. Earlier this week, I listened to my buddy Dolph and his buddy Steve Novotny. Steve does an afternoon show on River Talk Network, which is in the Wheeling area, and Dolph appears every Tuesday afternoon for the Mayhem Hour. And their discussion centered on the American dream. And is it possible for kids to have the American dream, the same American dream that you or I grew up with? Now, again, I'm a baby boomer. I was one of the children. I grew up in the 60s and the 70s. And, when you grew up, you talked about having a better life than your parents. And in some ways, I think I've achieved that, but in other ways, I haven't. And one of the reasons I say that is because, I've moved around an awful lot. Back then, when you grew up, you went to work, you worked for the same company for 30, 35 years, you retired, and you lived the rest of your life in comfortable retirement. Also, the divorce rate was not what it is now, and you're probably with your same spouse. But in the turbulent era of the 60s and 70s, all of that changed. Number one, women got equal rights, and that was a big thing because, before that, it was like caveman. You belonged to the man, and it was impossible for women to get credit. It's possible for women to stand on their own. Speaking of that, if you have a chance, there's a new series starring Brie Larson on Apple TV Plus. The first two episodes have dropped, and I got to tell you, it reflects that power dynamic or lack thereof. So I do recommend it to you real quick, but I digress from what I was talking about. So the question is, though, is the American dream possible? And the reason why I say this is because I look at my daughter and I look at Sandy's son, Matthew, and realistically, I don't see them owning a house, having that American dream, the same thing we did. Now, one of the reasons is because inflation and costs have gone up tremendously. Number two, people don't have that want to have their own house. Yeah, they want a car, and they'll spend a lot of money for it, but they don't want a house. And a lot of the people growing up now will rent a house. And this is a big deal. And this was a point that my buddy Dolph made, and I think he's right. People prefer to rent. Why? It's not that they don't have pride in ownership and they don't want to own, but they just don't think it's possible. And part of the problem is the cost of houses. I mean, listen, back when my parents bought my house, or the house that I grew up in, I want to say I think it was $30,000 tops. My mother sold it for $300,000. I mean, yeah, property values have just skyrocketed. And I'll even use it as the example of I was afraid to buy a house. My Stephanie's mom really talked me into buying a house, and we wanted to buy a house, and we bought the house, and within a year, the house had almost doubled in value, which is amazing. But we made the mistake of having a second mortgage and refinancing, and the house payment became bigger. And, we got to the point where, of course, I lost my job a couple times and just couldn't afford it, and we ended up losing it. But still, the idea of having a house is scary. And it's funny because I relate this to now because we're looking, Sandy and I are looking to retire. We want to downsize. Well, the problem is that what Sandy's mortgage is for the house we live in, that couldn't even get us a two-bedroom place. It's unreal, but it's the truth. And I don't think the American dream is dead, but I do think it has changed, and the parameters have changed. Now, there are some people who want to own their own house, but a lot of millennials and a lot of people these days want to, live in an apartment or live in a townhouse or live in a home rent a home, I should say, because it's cheaper in the long run. It gives you some flexibility. You're not locked into a mortgage. You don't have to sell something in order to move. And so many people move around for jobs because you're not anchored. And I think about, I was very lucky because in my radio career, I came down to Georgia for a couple of years, but basically my entire career was up in New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania. I worked there until I moved to Georgia in 2018. And that was not for a job at that point. It was to be with somebody. But the point I make is I knew radio was not going to, I never thought I'd own a home. I never thought I would. And I remember when we closed on the house, I started crying, just because of the fact it was overwhelming that I was actually buying a house. It was amazing. And my mother knew it too, and she said, you never thought you'd do that. Now, my sister, here's the funny thing. My sister is one of those people, she worked at two schools, but she essentially had the same job, and she's lived in the same house since 1987. She bought that one and has lived there ever since. More power to her, and she's still got the house, and it's great. Fortunately, I've lived in so many different places, I've lost count, I think, of how many places I live, because not that I moved around a lot, but I was here, there, and that kind of thing. It's amazing. How many people are still in your hometown? That's the other part of this. I'm constantly amazed at the number of people who still. I grew up in Caldwell, West Caldwell, New Jersey, and people who are still there. And I think it's really great, and I give them credit for being able to stay there and do things like that. I would have loved to, but again, it just wasn't in the cards, and I ended up down in Ocean County, and that's where I spent 30 years of my life. And I do not regret 1 second of living down in Ocean County, because it's a great place, great area. And I think one of the things I love about it is the proximity to New York and Philadelphia. But the flip side is, I'm down in Georgia now. I'm in Savannah. Now, Savannah's got its good points. I mean, one of the bad points, though, is no Wawa. I'm just saying, they're supposed to put one in Georgia sometime soon. I hope they do. But I still, like I said, I can't complain about where I live. I just wonder what my daughter will have for the American dream, because it just seems like it's getting further and further away. But then again, maybe the American dream has changed. That's going to wrap it up for Tripp's Take for October the 19th, 2023. Love to hear your comments and questions about my podcast. Feel free to email trippstake@gmail.com. Fantasy football players, hey, the Hall of Famer Mike Sheck and I are there for you to help you. The Fantasy Sultans podcast you can find on Spotify for podcasters, also Apple, Google, iHeart, and other podcast hosts. Also, they're on YouTube. Just search for the Fantasy Sultans. You can also, of course, get Tripp's Take on YouTube. Just search for Tripp's Take. If you like the music of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you can listen to WTRSradio.com online. Join me again next week. For now, I'm Tripp Rogers. Thanks for listening. Make it a great one.